Here's something that is quite disturbing. It says here it's becoming so onerous to employ in South Africa that businesses opting for alternatives to direct employment, we've just been speaking about that, alternatives like outsourcing, subcontracting, automation, offshoring and new technology. In the Joburg Power Lunch studio is John Botha, who is Director of PMI, that's the Production Management Institute. John, these are quite strong words. It's onerous to employ somebody, and it's even more onerous to try and get rid of somebody that isn't quite meeting your expectations, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality of the fact is that every part of the employment value chain and the employment life cycle is now specifically regulated by law. So along each of those particular stages in the employment life cycle, there are significant regulations with various fines and penalties attached to those.
You gave a briefing to business this morning. What were the essential points that came out of that briefing, John?
I think the issue is, and what's really going to be interesting going forwards, is on the one hand you have employment laws and the bills that have been renegotiated at NEDLAC, which effectively increase the regulatory burden on employers and also the fines and the compliance burdens attached to that. But interestingly, with the BBBEE codes being published for comment recently, the reality is that the very thing that government and unions are trying to avoid, in other words, they're trying to avoid the outsourcing, subcontracting and use of labor brokers, the very thing they've been trying to avoid is now what's being driven, for example, through the BBBEE codes. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the codes and the elements in the code, there's a significant weighting of 40 points out of 100 points that are now applicable to procurement and enterprise development. So an organization that's looking at employing or that needs human capital effectively has two options. The one option is they employ the human capital, and as we figured out, an employer-employee relationship is fraught with challenges in our environment. The other option is for them to bring human capital in through the procurement process, receive one invoice from a transformed supplier, and from there you'd find a downward turn in the traditional direct employment relationship.
Seems to me, as a layman in this field, that it's incredibly complicated. I'm very simple in my approach to markets. You buy something cheap, you sell something expensive, for example. You employ somebody. If that person doesn't do a good job, then you should have the freedom to be able to get rid of that person. All the layers and layers of administration involved. It almost, as we try to create small and medium-sized businesses that will grow into big businesses and maybe even one day be listed on the JSE, we're just putting so many barriers in the way of creating a middle class in South Africa.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is there have been some good responses from government to the challenges that we face. For example, growing small businesses and growing employment. The Department of Trade and Industry's codes, as I've just said, in my mind are a very good response, specifically because they have added weighting to enterprise development. They've added weight to procuring from value-adding suppliers, which hopefully will result in employment creation drivers. But alongside that, you have the Department of Labour and the labour laws in the country kicking against that with increasing the regulatory component. Just an example of the contradiction between labour law and transformation law is the reality that under transformation, they've decreased the weighting on employment equity, for example. So employment equity used to count for 25 points under the current scorecard. The proposal is to reduce it to 15 points. Yet you see government being very concerned from Department of Labour that employment equity and equitable representation is not being achieved in South Africa. Yet Department of Labour are imposing greater fines on companies for not complying with employment equity, but DTI are decreasing the weightings in respect of employment equity on the scorecard. So there's an absence of strong leadership at a very top level to ensure that these different policies synergize with each other.
Yeah, you say the inconsistencies between some of the provisions of the Labour bills, particularly the Employment Equity and Labour Relations Bill amendments, were astonishing. That's your word. You go on to say the most significant example of such contradictions lies in the Labour Relations Bill, you've just mentioned that, which limits equal pay for work of equal value to vulnerable persons. At the same time, the Employment Equity Bill proposes equal pay for all employees, from general workers to managing directors. And just before, those are your words, let me just go on to someone else now. Herman Mashaba, chairperson of the Free Market Foundation, says, we now have the unfortunate situation, John, that the labour laws that were intended to make life better for the poorest South Africans are making their lives worse. Instead of having secure jobs with decent wages, 7.5 million members of the potential workforce have no jobs at all, which is a disaster. So it seems to me everyone has the same sort of consensus that something's got to be done, but there's a small minority, maybe it's the unions, maybe it's an intransigent government, they don't have the will to do something about it.
Well, the reality is that everyone would like a prosperous economy with everyone in decent jobs and also with all the benefits attached to those jobs. But the challenge, for example, is with the imposition of equal pay for work of equal value. It's not that it's a contested principle. Morally it's correct and it should be. The issue, though, is that they're introducing that principle into a labour market that is not mature enough and that hasn't grown yet to accommodate those types of changes. So it's almost, sabotaging the process before you've even got out of the starting blocks. And the concern to me is we have the new growth path, we have the National Development Plan, we have the HRD strategy, and I can probably rattle off 5 or 6 other national policy documents and strategies. And each and every one of those, in my view, are being undermined by the relative challenges that the new labour laws are going to impose on employers. There's absolutely no motivation for employers right now to employ more people than they absolutely need. And secondly, the reality is that overall employment going forwards is going to grow, but only in what we would call the vulnerable sector, the atypical forms of employment, such as subcontracting, outsourcing, and labour broking. Because right now, employers are facing economic cycles that are way out of their control, and they need to respond very quickly to adjusting their costs and their cost curves to the revenue curves that are very, very volatile at the moment.